welcome Vishal Agarwal ji from Minnesota to start the session. Of course, as I already mentioned, Vishal himself is a great luminary in the field of the history, specifically, his work on rebutting the Aryan Invasion theory. And I'm really looking forward to this interaction between Vishal Agarwal ji and Michel. And I'm really glad that Michel requested Vishal ji to be on this session. I know they've been collaborating for a very long time, and I'm sure this session is going to be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for the brief introduction. I hope you can all hear me correctly. It's a delight to have a conversation with Padma Shri Mr. Danino on this topic of the Aryan myth, which has been studied for scholarly and not so scholarly reasons for 150 years. Actually, 1.5 hours is too short a time to discuss all the facets of it, but we'll try to make it as best as we can. So,
Vishal, I'm sorry to interrupt you right in the beginning, but I was thinking, we could have a break at 6:30. What do you think? Do you think that's okay to have a break in the middle of the session?
Oh, I'm totally fine with that. I think it'll give some rest to Danino.
Okay, we'll have a short break in the middle of at 6:30. Thank you.
Okay. So to set the tone, the ancient world has just a handful of Bronze Age civilizations, of which the Harappan civilization is one. And unfortunately, it's the least understood and most controversial civilization. So I would like to understand from Mr. Danino that we have the Egyptian culture, we have the Mesopotamian, Sumerian civilizations, we have the Chinese, the Olmecs. What is so different about the Harappan civilization? Why is it so controversial? Why is it so little understood? And yet we claim that it's the only civilization which has actually continued down to the present times. Is it because we don't understand our own culture?
Thank you, Michel, and delighted to have you here. And just call me Michel, please. We don't have to be so formal. And thank you so much for accepting my invitation. And apologies for forcing you to be, up and going so early. You are in the US. I hope we have not inconvenienced you. So we have now this session where basically it's just not the Aryan issue, but we are going to discuss about, yes, the proto-history of India. And I think you've asked the right question to start with. When the Harappan civilization was discovered, let us just recall for a minute, it was 1921-22, and by 1924, it was understood that, archaeologists were dealing with something completely new. It was a new civilization of the Bronze Age, which had not yet been identified. Others had been, so Egyptian, Mesopotamian were already known. And of course, the Greek or Mediterranean, like Minoan, for example, civilizations, which also extended to the Bronze Age. So they soon realized that it was very different. It was different in several ways. The first is that some archaeologists found it disappointing. They were disappointed, like, Mortimer Wheeler will have that famous quote about miles and miles of bricks and monotony or something like that, or monotonous brick buildings. So they were, they were used to the very glittering Egyptian tombs, and of course the fantastic pyramids and the colossal temples with colossal statues, and there was nothing like this here. Just remnants of brick houses and more houses and more houses and a few streets and very, very few art objects compared to Egypt. I mean, there's absolutely no comparison. And very little writing also, a few seals, a few inscriptions here and there, nothing like those colossal frescoes on temple walls that you find in Egypt. So there was no doubt that it was extremely different in nature, and they tried to make sense of it. And for a long time, this lack of spectacular finds, you know, made it a kind of marginal civilization. It was not something very important to deal with. Well, it was an Indian civilization. It was the beginning of something in India. But of course, for all the scholars concerned with India, it was extremely important because suddenly, before it, you see, before it, as you know very well, the most remote times were the Buddhist times, or let us say the Mahajanapada times, the times 600 BC at the most, 700 BC perhaps, where the Gangetic states were forming. And this was the most remote antiquity of India that was known, except for some scattered Paleolithic tools, but then nothing was known of those Paleolithic communities anyway. So suddenly India jumped 2,000 years. It was in fact initially 3,000 years, but those dates were corrected later. And then got a foundation in the Bronze Age, which whereas all the, you know, Buddhist era and the Mahajanapadas and all that belong to the later Iron Age. So that was, of course, a most important relocation of Indian beginnings. But then many questions started being asked, precisely that question which you flag of continuity. Was it really the ancestor, direct ancestor of the later Gangetic developments, which are going to evolve into the classical civilization of India? And then there were two schools of thought. Right from the beginning, some archaeologists said, yes, we can see signs of continuity. We can see some objects which we recognize. We can see, typical Indian customs, ornaments, for example, the anklets, some kind of earrings, some kinds of bangles, etc., which are all typically Indian. So there were a lot of features, very humble perhaps, but that did speak of Indianness in the figurines and so on. But others were looking at the broader problem that of the Aryan invasion, which was the dominant theory in those days, and still to some extent remains dominant today. But it was extremely strong in those days because it was completely racial, in the sense that this was the time of the Aryan race, the very, very same Aryan race that Hitler is going to build his ideology upon. That's Hitler is just, you know, going to appear on the scene a few years after the Harappan civilization was discovered. And then the problem is that how do you fit when the Aryan invasion theory declared that Aryans streamed into India as a new race, conquering race, and subjugated the autochthones, the primitives, populations of India, native populations of India. There was obviously some readjustment to be done, because in the old theory, the Aryan race, mighty Aryan race, was bringing civilization to a totally primitive India. And then suddenly there is actually a civilization at a date older than the conventional date for the Aryan invasion, 1500 BC. And then this civilization is obviously there. And so then the Aryans now are the primitive barbarians. So there was a big switch and readjustment. They were the primitive barbarians, still conquering, still aggressive, and still from a different race, who came and, you know, perhaps destroyed this civilization. Just like and so this was all patterned on the decline of the Roman Empire, where you had a brilliant civilization which declined maybe from within, but also from without due to barbarian invasions. And that was a very convenient model to be transposed here. And the Aryans became the barbarians who destroyed the Harappan or Indus civilization. Indus Valley civilization, as it was called then, which let me emphasize is an obsolete term, because we have now so many sites well away from the Indus Valley. So So there were several issues at the same time, and we all know that there were different schools of thought. There were still a number of Indian scholars who emphasized the continuity. And there was one of them who, in 1937, I think it was the first K.N. Dixit, if I'm not mistaken, he decided to call it the Proto-Indian Civilization. And in fact, had there not been a partition with Pakistan, had India remained an undivided country, it's quite possible that this would have been the term accepted today, that we might have called it the Proto-Indian Civilization. And in many ways, I think it's in a way, the best term, because it emphasizes this continuity. There are 2-3 schools of thought. I should be very brief and now give you the picture today so that we understand the problem, because we always try to simplify issues, and we should not. The Aryan issue is complex. It touches many disciplines. It touches many theoretical problems of continuity, for example. What does it mean, continuity? What is transmitted? What is not transmitted? We do know that the cities, the Harappan cities, declined towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC. And by 1900 BC, almost all of them were no longer functional as cities. And that subtle order, that state administration, what constitute a state, was gone by 1900. So there was a discontinuity at a certain level, no doubt. And yet, more and more in recent decades, a lot of archaeologists, whether foreign archaeologists or Indian archaeologists, emphasize also the continuity of the cultural transmission. So we have the American archaeologists, Jim Shaffer, Jonathan Kenoya, and the Alchins, the British archaeologists. And we have, of course, a large number of Indian archaeologists, our doyen, Professor Bibilal, who has just turned 99 and is still producing studies and books. And a whole lot of other archaeologists, S.P. Gupta, Rian Mishra, and many others who emphasize this continuity and additionally rejected the Aryan model. So what is the Aryan model today? Today, after World War II, this race component has been dropped by most scholars. It's only a few backward scholars like D.N. Jha, for example, of Delhi University, and a few others who still view those Aryans as fair-skinned, blonde, etc., by misreading some passages of the Rig Veda, as we know very well. So mostly the racial component has been dropped. And what defendants of the Aryan model, like the Alchins were, for example, are saying is that, okay, they were not a race. They were scattered populations. We don't know exactly who they were, but they were those who brought Indo-European languages into India, and they came after the Harappan civilization. So they may not have destroyed it. They came after it, and they occupied the land, and slowly, gradually, some kind of cultural fusion occurred. Their language became dominant, and then Indo-European languages spread, and this Aryan culture also spread. So that is the, those who still maintain this theory of, let us say, an Aryan migration, usually no longer an aggressive invasion, more of a peaceful migration, there are again many degrees in it. For example, I'm just situating the problem as briefly as I can. For example, the Alchin, Raymond Alchin, the late Raymond Alchin, who was very passionate about Indian archaeology. He loved the Indian civilization. There's no doubt about that aspect. Raymond Alchin was honest and recognized, therefore, the features of cultural transmission and continuity. And he even saw some Vedic elements in Harappan civilization. The Vedas, which were supposed to be the product of Aryans who would have come into India later. So, for example, there is this famous seal where you have a bull mating with a prone, reclining woman. And he said it's so strikingly the Vedic theme of the union of the bull of heaven and the earth. So he had a theory that some Aryans had entered India earlier during the Harappan times. They were not those who composed the Vedas. They came to India, they fused with the Harappans, transmitted some of their culture, which was Aryan, Vedic, but not yet the written text. And therefore, and then there was a second wave of Aryans in the second millennium BC, and those were the ones who composed the Vedas and brought the Indo-Aryan languages. So you can see that there can be many theories. And when a few years ago, as you know very well, and you have highlighted it and discussed it yourself in some of your excellent writings, when it was shown that there were no anthropological signs of a new population coming. We have the work of Kenneth Kennedy, the late Kenneth Kennedy of formerly Cornell University, who studied hundreds of skeletons with his various students and disciples and other anthropologists, and they never found discontinuity after the Harappan civilization. So there was this, and there was continuity in cultural transmission, and also there was the fact that all these supposed signs of destruction of the Harappan cities were rejected one after another. So when this became clear, archaeologists started asking, why do we need the Aryans at all? As archaeologists, we are not linguists. We're not bothered with the linguistic issues. We see continuity on the ground. We don't see the arrival of a new people. We don't see the arrival of a new culture. Even if we assume that the Aryans came in small groups, small settlements, moving settlements, and we can't trace them, still there should have been different ornaments, different weapons perhaps, different tools, different pottery styles, different art forms. Still it should have left a trace, and there is nothing like that. So as you know, some of the proponents of the theory did not want to give up and went on diluting it. So we have the famous case of Professor Michael Witzel of Harvard University, who was ready to dilute it to the point that when one Afghan tribe overstaying in India during the winter-summer transhumance, overstaying in India, one single Afghan tribe, Indo-European speaking Afghan tribe, overstaying in India would have been enough to overturn the landscape. So the whole linguistic and cultural landscape. So my own conclusion is that very much it boils down to a question of numbers. And this is a point I've made, repeated in a few recent papers, which I think Srinivas has shared with our audience today, is that how many Aryans do you want? Do you want a massive migration? And there are still people like R.S. Sharma wanted it to be massive because he said it has to be massive. The late R.S., Marxist historian R.S. Sharma, he said it has to be massive because they have to swamp the local languages and culture, which is logical. But we are told that it need not be massive. Just one small tribe is enough to overturn the entire landscape. So is that feasible? So how many Aryans do you need to do that major switch to a new language, a new culture? So this is basically, for me, one major issue where scholars are careful not to pronounce because they know it is tricky. The massive invasion can be easily rejected on the grounds of archaeology and bioanthropology. And if it is minor, if it is small numbers, then you have to answer that question. How do you allow a small number of people, he used the word trickle-in theory, as you yourself pointed out, trickle-in theory. How do you have people trickling into the subcontinent when we still have a lot of late Harappan cultures in place? It's not that this northwest of India is desert, it's not desert, it is still densely populated. We have a lot of late Harappan and post-Harappan cultures, painted grey culture, and then the ochre-colored pottery culture, and a lot of others which are they are named after the style of pottery, which is another theoretical, actually tricky issue. But anyway, let's not go into that. And how do you explain that these small populations, Aryan speaking, because now Aryan has taken on purely a linguistic meaning and or cultural, but no longer racial, thankfully, even though in India, we continue in our textbooks to visualize Aryans as a race, as a distinct race. And that's very shameful. But so this question of numbers is unresolved. And this is one of the weakest points, ultimately, of that theory. So I've tried to give a kind of broad canvas, and I'm sorry if I was too long, but now you can build upon this, Vishal.
Well, I think it's interesting you mentioned how many Aryans do you need to Aryanize India? And I live right here in Minnesota, which is 83% Caucasian or white, and only 1% Native American. And yet the whole state is studded with names of Native American origin. We have the Sioux Indians and the Ojibwe tribes, Minnesota itself, Minnehaha Falls, but in the whole of northern India, Pakistan, we don't see a single river, a single lake, a single geographical feature which has a non-Aryan etymology. So this brings me to the next major topic related to this controversy. When I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, in our textbooks in India, we used to read that the Sarswati is a mythical river. But in 1990s, all of a sudden, we shed light on what we call the Sarswati Paradigm, and you've also published a book on it. And interestingly, the first one to explore the Ghaggar Valley area was Sir Aurel Stein, more than a century back, I believe, but his writings didn't get much publicity. And when people started revisiting this Aryan invasion theory, they said, well, you know, the Rigveda talks about the Saraswati River and it's full of farmlands and towns and villages. And when the Indian archaeologists started re-exploring that a river in that same region, a dried up river, they found, and I think you've counted more than 2,000 inhabitations. So all of a sudden, this logical question was asked, is this Ghaggar River, which was supposedly the epicenter of the Harappan civilization, is it the same as the Vedic Saraswati River? So would you like to dwell on that Saraswati paradigm, since you've synthesized a lot of data on that?
So you have put a very central question here, and I have to try to sum up the whole issue of this river, because it does bring a very important testimony. And it's extremely interesting that by the end of the 19th century, long before the Harappan civilization was discovered, there was a near complete consensus, with just one or two exceptions, actually two. Otherwise, all archaeologists, geographers, topographers, archaeologists of those times were in a consensus that this Ghaggar Hakra bed must be the relic of the Saraswati of Vedic times, of the Vedic text, because they only knew the Saraswati through the Vedic text. So in fact, the problem was this, that in the Rigveda, Saraswati is praised as a mighty river flowing from the mountain to the sea, and flowing between the Yamuna and the Satluj. This is, I mean, to sum up, there's a lot more, in fact, in the Rigveda, because there are maybe tributaries of the Saraswati, there are other things. But it's a river which flows all the way to the sea. And then in the later literature, starting from the Brahmanas in particular, we see that there is a disappearance, a point of disappearance. It's called Vinashana, so loss, disappearance, sometimes adarshana, and that point actually becomes a point of famous pilgrimage, perhaps the first pilgrimage of all Indian traditions, that's my guess, where that pilgrimage consisted in starting from the point of disappearance and moving upward to upstream to the source of the Saraswati. So there is an evolution, and actually O.P. Bharadwaj, formerly of Kurukshetra University, authored a brilliant paper where he showed that this Vinashana point was not fixed. It kept moving upward itself. So Saraswati is receding with further and further layers of the literature until it's completely lost, completely gone. And Kalidasa uses somewhere Saraswati as a symbol for loss. You know, it becomes almost a synonym. If you say Saraswati, it means loss, something that has disappeared. So that evolution is very clear. And in 1855, a French geographer, Louis Vivien de Saint-Martin, a leading geographer of his days, was following closely explorations from British topographers. They were, you know, the British colonial authorities had to make maps, precise maps for military purposes to understand their dominions. And they were very good at map making, we know that, at topography. So they explored all this area for also other reasons, which I've narrated in my book, so I'll not go over all details here. And they found that there was this huge dry bed flowing from the Shivaliks through what is today Haryana, what is today northern Rajasthan, what is today the Indian Punjab and Cholistan in Pakistan, and all the way to the Rann of Kutch. And he found that this dry bed was between Yamuna and Satluj, as Rickvie was saying. It was quite huge in some places, and it seemed to testify to a much, you know, mightier flow in some remote past, undateable, of course, in those days. And there was also a tributary still today called Sarswati in Haryana. What is today Haryana, of course. Haryana did not exist in the 19th century. And therefore, with all this data, he was able to put together the concept that this must be the relic of the Vedic Saraswati River. And this was immediately adopted by Max Muller, by others, and there was no doubt at all in anybody's mind that this was the Saraswati, and the debate was closed, you might say. That was over. Problem solved. No, not quite. Why? Because the Harappan civilization was discovered. And eventually, as you said rightly, Mark Orenstein, who in 1917 had authored, so let's say a century ago, had authored, because Mark Orenstein was not only a fantastic explorer, adventurer, archaeologist, he was also a Sanskritist. You know that he left a brilliant translation of Raja Tarangini, for example. So he had very good foundations in Sanskrit, and he authored a paper on the rivers of North India, where he also endorsed this identification between the Ghaggar, Hakra, and the Saraswati. And by the time when he was 78, I think, it was 1941, he decided he wanted to explore that area because in till 1940, the Harappan civilization was broadly confined to the Indus Valley and of course the tributaries of the Indus, the entire Indus plains. And therefore the term of Indus Valley civilization was justified. But there had been hunches already, even John Marshall had suspected that it must have extended further eastward. So he decided to explore the region between what is today Rajasthan, where Kalibangan was already identified as a potentially prehistoric site by Luigi Tessitori, the Italian scholar, much earlier. He started from there, but he missed the Harappan nature of Kalibangan. And then on horseback and then camelback, he was 78, went into Cholistan, where he identified Harappan features. So this raises actually a very important theoretical question. First of all, how do you define that a site belongs to a particular culture? So this is done in archaeology by, you know, what is known as the assemblage. Assemblage is a French word which means a collection of different things. So typically in archaeology, if you have a bit of pottery that is recognizable, some ornaments that are recognizable, some seals that are recognizable, if you have enough of variety of things that are recognizable as being similar to what you found in Mohenjo-daro or Harappa, then you will declare it to be Harappan. So that's exactly what he found, and that's exactly what he declared. In a report which mentioned the name Saraswati. It was called a tour along the lost Saraswati, something like that. And an archaeological tour, that was the title of his paper, an archaeological tour along the lost Saraswati. So still there was no doubt that this was Saraswati of old. But slowly a problem grew, that along this Saraswati, this Ghagar, the sites that were found were mostly Harappan, or of much later cultures, but they were mostly Harappan. So we have a Vedic river, or rather, let's now sum up the problem in a nutshell. We have a bed, dry, mostly dry. Of course, it's not totally dry. It still flows, and sometimes very powerfully during the monsoon, but not a perennial river in any case. We have such a river which has been identified by consensus with the Saraswati of Vedic literature. And what do we find? We don't find the sites of a different culture that perhaps could be identified as Aryan. We find Harappan sites of Harappan culture. So what's going on? We were told that Aryans came much later. And this river was revered in the Veda, but it is a heartland now of the Harappan civilization, the Indus civilization, which is no longer Indus Valley civilization. And by the way, there are also a few sites appearing in Gujarat and a few other locations like northern Maharashtra and so on. So it is extending broadly in all directions. So the point is that now this river, when the survey of Harappan site was complete, fairly complete, by 1984, and the late Jagapati Joshi, whom I had the privilege of meeting and discussing with, I've been very lucky to meet all those great archaeologists, the late S.P. Gupta, the late V.N. Mishra, and others. When he published in 1984 a fairly comprehensive survey of Harappan sites, what became very clear is that you know that we have early Harappan culture, the antecedents of the Harappan cities. We don't have cities as yet. We have villages growing into towns, and then at some point by 2600 BC or so, the towns, flourish as cities. It's a different concept. There is a powerful state of administration behind that, right? But by 1900 BC, they declined. So when Jagapati Joshi published, he had a few collaborators, by the way, published his survey, it was found that in the late Harappan phase, 1900 BC onward, all the Harappan sites which occupied the heart of the Saraswati basin, or the Ghagar basin, as you wish to call it, disappeared and were abandoned. They did not have a late Harappan phase. Kalibangan, for example, had a full mature phase and very thriving as a city on the edge of the Saraswati, and must have used the river as a means of communication for trade in particular. And by 2000 or 1900 BC, of course, the radiocarbon days, as we know, are a little bit fluid. It is abandoned. It doesn't have a late Harappan phase. People do not remain there at all. As they do in Harappa in Punjab, we have a late Harappan phase there. In Dholavira in Gujarat, we have a late Harappan phase. What does it mean? Late Harappan means a reversal to a rural lifestyle. People can no longer maintain this urban order, which requires an administration. It requires something holding it together. That subtle thing disintegrates. So people still live in Harappa, in Dholavira, as a kind of village living on the ruins of the city, but not in Kalibangan, not on any of the sites like Banawali, like Rakigari, like Birana. All these sites occupying the central basin of the Saraswati are just abandoned. So the conclusion was immediately that the river must have disappeared, because that would be the major cause for people to abandon those sites. Otherwise, why should they leave? They could have continued living on the spot even in as a rural late Harappan lifestyle, but they don't. They go, they leave. So the consensus was that among the archaeologists that the river must have disintegrated, and this is the beginning of the disintegration that the literature portrays so well. Okay, so all is fine except the chronology. Because according to the chronology, Aryans, if you go by the Aryan migration theory, enter India, 1500 BC, whatever, they start composing the Vedas. The Vedas worship Saraswati as a mighty river, and this would be by 1200 BC, and it's supposed to be a mighty river, and then only the disintegration of the river would begin. So we have a mismatch of something like 700–800 years, which is very hard to reconcile. So how did those who still swear by the Aryan invasion or migration theory, which has now, we can visualize that it has gone through many avatars, as David Frawley rightly said, once upon a time, and we can see that it keeps mutating, you know, like coronavirus, it has many multiple mutations. So that's what happens with the Aryan virus, if I may call it that way. And now there's a new interpretation that you see, it's like this. The Aryans were actually located, worshipping the Saraswati in Afghanistan, not here, because there is a small tributary of the Helmand River in Afghanistan, which has a cognate name with Saraswati. It is Hakravati or something like that. You can tell us better, Vishal. You're more knowledgeable. And they worshipped the original Saraswati there. And then they came, entered India, carried the memory of that original Saraswati, and they transferred that memory to the Ghaggar River because they didn't want to lose that memory. There are only two problems. One is that there is no such indication in the Rig Veda. Nowhere in the Rig Veda do we have explicitly an older Saraswati and a newer Saraswati. There is just one Saraswati and only one. Two, and this is a question I asked 2 years ago, Professor Rajesh Kochar, astrophysicist who wrote a book called The Vedic People, and who has maintained, refurbished this old theory of Afghan Saraswati, which had one or two defendants in the 19th century, especially Hillebrand, the German scholar Hillebrand. So, but they were totally a minority position in the 19th century. Now he refurbished it. And he said, you know, they came and then they transferred this name to the Ghaggar. So I asked him, Professor Kochar, tell us why the Aryans, wanting to preserve the name of this Saraswati, fine. They crossed the Indus. They could have given the Indus the name. They crossed the Jhelum, the Chenam, they crossed the Ravi perhaps. It depends exactly where they cross, of course. They crossed the Bias. They crossed the Satluj. They crossed all these rivers. They never rename them Saraswati. They wait until they they reach a dry bed, because archaeology now tells us that this river was defunct. They wait and he himself admits in his book that Ghaggar was defunct by that time. So he said, you accept it is defunct, and you are telling us that they cross all these rivers and they wait until they reach a defunct bed to remember this glorious Saraswati of old. It doesn't make sense. And his answer was, and this was in Bangalore in a high profile event, which I have a paper coming out of it, which has been shared. And his answer was, I am tired. That was the end of his answer. There was no answer. So these are the kind of paradoxes that the Saraswati throws up. And normally it would be simple logic to say that fine, we have a river which declined, and therefore the sites that we find along the bed of the river while it was thriving must have something to do with this Vedic culture, which first composed those hymns while the river also was thriving. And Max Muller himself said that the disappearance of the Saraswati marks the end of the Vedic age. That's what Max Muller wrote in the 1860s. The disappearance of the Saraswati marks the end of the Vedic age. It means the age of the Samhitas All right. So he's very clear on this. So, well, we know today that the date is about 1900 BC. So 1900 BC marks the end of the Vedic age in a logical way, according to Max Muller. So this is very briefly how I would put the problem, but you can supplement it because you are actually more knowledgeable than I am.
So since in 5 minutes we have a break, I'll just ask you a question which probably requires a very brief answer. So just like you've elaborated on how the Aryan invasion theory has been mutated beyond recognition, but it's still there. The Saraswati paradigm itself has been questioned or denied now in the face of overwhelming evidence. One of the reasons that's now been given to deny that Ghaggar was Saraswati, and in fact, even noted archaeologists like the late Gregory Posel wrote a paper saying that the Saraswati never reached the ocean. And so the Rigvedic statement, Agiribhya Asamudrat, from the mountains to the ocean is just a hyperbole. And the argument he gave was that if you go downstream, there are no Harappan sites on the upper reaches of the Nara River in the northern part of Sindh. But in the last 10 to 15 years, I believe Pakistani archaeologists have actually found close to 150 early Harappan.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're right, Vishal. And I've been in touch with some of them, luckily, and I can perhaps, if time permits, I can probably find the name of two of them. You are right. Sorry?
Dr. Qasid Mullah, I believe.
Exactly. That was the name I was trying to remember. You are absolutely right. So they have found on the eastern side of the Rohri Hills, there are in Sindh, towards the southern end of Cholistan, there are a set of low hills called the Rohri Hills, which were actually a source of semi-precious stones and chert for the Harappans. We know that the Harappans were mining them, and the Saraswati would have flowed on the eastern side of them. And they have found a lot of sites of Harappan culture. So they are actually closing the gap. And there are also a few even further downstream, closer to the Run of Kutch. So they are closing the gap. Of course, they don't want to be too emphatic about it because this would actually, re-establish the continuity of the river. It's also difficult to say we need more geological studies in that region. You see, we have now plenty of them, and maybe we can very briefly discuss them later. We have plenty of them in the Haryana-Rajasthan region. From the Shivaliks to the Indo-Pakistan border, we have quite a lot of geological studies now, with some more coming shortly. But in this region of Cholistan and beyond, very few. So we need more sedimentological studies where, you can read the whole chronology of the sediments and recreate something more reliable. So what we know for sure is that the river had a complex history. It is not that there was a mighty river flowing all the way, all the time, and then suddenly it disappeared. What Posel said was not wrong. There is a delta in Cholistan, and this must be a later stage in the evolution of the river where at some point it weakened. And perhaps it was an arm of the Sutlej that fed the sites lower downstream. So there is a complex evolution, no doubt. If you see the ISRO paper, ISRO, the satellite imagery papers of the Indian Satellite Research Organization, they've drawn several beds that they think the river occupied purely from remote sensing. And obviously the river has shifted considerably in the course of its evolution. There is something like 100 kilometers shift in the very flat plains of that whole region. We still, it will take time before we can recreate the entire evolution of the river reliably. Yes, it's very interesting that the gap is closing, and we have Harappan culture almost all along the Ghaggar Hakra bed. It's very interesting.
So in conclusion, the drift of the newly emerging data is also in that same direction. There is nothing
Yes.
new data which contradicts the Saraswati Vedic Harappan equation. So I think it's time now for a break, Srinivasji.
Yes, yes. So let's have a 10-minute break, and hopefully that's good enough time for getting some breakfast for yourself, Vishal, and maybe some coffee for everybody else. Thank you. We'll assemble at 6:40 again.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
everybody can stay on, just mute and switch off the videos, and we will just rejoin. Yeah.
Srinivas, you can have a look at any questions that are there and compile them.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Welcome back, Professor Danino. I think there is some shade falling on you. Okay, that's all right. It's all right. Yeah, I think you're still muted.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
So shall we resume the session?
Sure.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, great to have you back again. We probably can continue till about 7:15, maybe. Right.
Sure.
And then we can have some questions.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was just thinking about it. The last two sessions we've had, the retrospective prospective sessions, were with Professor Balagangadhara and Professor Vishwa Adluri, both of whom were Indians who have settled outside India and have become citizens of other countries. And today we have, a non-Indian who's become a citizen of India and in India is doing fantastic work. It's an interesting observation. Thank you very much, Professor Danino. Please, let's get started.
And I think that's a very pertinent comment, because towards the end, the overarching theme of this particular panel is, what makes one an Indian? And that's what Mr. Michel has also written about. So that brings me to my next question. Attempts have been made to state or prove that the Vedic culture is very different from the Harappan civilization. One of the paradigms, one of these arguments that, and you've written about it recently, was they say that the Harappan realm was a very peaceful civilization. There is no evidence of wars. You don't find weapons. You don't even find a single sword that you can identify really as a sword. Whereas the Rigveda is according to them, a very horsey text, because it's full of war chariots and horses. And Indra Devta is himself sometimes termed as a rowdy god, and he's a very prominent Devta, a deity in the Rig Veda. Recently, however, you have written a very remarkable paper called Demilitarizing the Rig Veda. And what you've tried to show there is that a lot of these references are very allegorical. So would you like to comment on that? You're muted. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Michel. Thank you. I'm glad that you are bringing this point, because it touches a very deep issue. It touches the whole meaning of the Rig Veda. And we already know that the text was tortured in the 19th century into yielding an Aryan race, which of course was thrown into the dustbin of history after doing enough harm, and the whole Nazi ideology was founded on the work of European Indologists and linguists. This is too often forgotten. But then, to my mind, the more I look at the Rig Veda, and the more I feel that it continues to be tortured. And we still do not look at it in its plain meaning. What present scholars are trying to extract from the Rig Veda is still a context of war. It's still that people calling themselves Aryans still conquer, native populations which are called variously the Basus, the Basas, or the Panis, and so on. And I think this is still text torturing. Actually, I'm borrowing the phrase text torturing from Trautmann, Thomas Trautmann, Professor Thomas Trautmann, who authored a beautiful book called Aryans and British India, I think. Very important, because he demolishes the whole racial interpretation reading of the Rig Veda. He nevertheless goes by the, Aryan or Indo-Aryan migration into India for linguistic reasons mostly. This is a good reminder that it's possible to have, there are multiple schools of thought in this whole debate. But I think that this whole question of what do these battles mean? It is true that there is strong, sometimes violent language in the Rigveda. That's undeniable. But when does it appear? It appears when when we see Indra, as you mentioned. Sometimes it is Surya, sometimes it is Agni. It varies, in fact, and it's very, very important to note the mutability of this light motive. It is one single light motive taking a lot of shapes, where we see either Indra or Surya or Agni, sometimes rishis with them, sometimes rishis alone, going and smashing the caves, or let us say the dens, the hidden places of the Dasyus, sometimes the Panis, at the foot of mountains. And so this is one central aspect. And in fact, to me, this is the central theme, the central leitmotif. There are other very important things in the Rigveda, but this one comes through, and I want one day to find time to publish a study on this theme alone. I want to count, I'm sure it comes at least 50 times in the entire Rigveda, scattered in all the books, all the mandalas, and certainly this is a very central preoccupation, this going and smashing of the fortresses, the strong places, the purs of the, what is called pur in Rigveda, of those Dasyus. So what are those purs? Of course, the pur were interpreted as cities, and they became the Harappan cities because there are no other cities that would match the word pur. But we have very important papers, one by Erdosi, George Erdosi, another one by our friend Nicolas Cazanas, who show that this concept of pur is not a city as we understand it. It is a protective place. It's a place, it's a strong place of defense, of protection. And it's not as if only the Dasyus have purs, the so-called Aryans also have. The ones who are on the side of the gods also are. And the gods themselves are sometimes compared to pur. Even Saraswati, the river, is also a pur at some point. So it's a concept of protection. It's a concept of occult defense. It has nothing to do with a proper city as we understand it. So therefore, what are these, and why is it that the result of this campaign, this apparently military campaign against the Dasyus or the Panis, and the smashing of their secret places, and it is always the smashing of the mountain. The mountain is split asunder by either mantras or by Indra's Vajra or by some other weapons, but the mountain is split asunder. So there are endless variations of this leitmotif. It varies and varies, and it is retold in with different names, but it's always the same story. And what happens is that when the mountain is shattered and the caves are exposed, then a lot of different things happen, which again are one and the same. Either cows are released, or sometimes, and I've given a lot of references in that paper, but I hope one day to go back to it in greater detail. Or cows and horses are released, because sometimes they are keeping cows and horses, those Dasyus, even though we are told that the horse is Aryan, we find a lot of horses with the Dasyus, with the Panis, explicitly. And this is never commented upon, of course, by our invasionists or migrationists. And we find sometimes also, instead of cows, we find treasures being released, or we find rivers being released, or sometimes, once I think we find the sun, the 8th sun, hidden sun, Martanda, being released. So something is released, and it can be a river, it can be cows, it can be horses, it can be treasures, it can be all of that. What Sri Aurobindo, and this of course I accept fully, that I'm totally influenced by Sri Aurobindo's reading of the Rigveda, which was not based on any intellectual exercise. It was actually for him a spiritual discovery, because he was going through certain experiences in his physical body which were beyond the usual spiritual realizations, and he could not find an explanation for them in, let us say, the Upanishads or you know, the classical texts. Those realizations he had before, but when certain phenomena started appearing, powers arising in his body and certain barriers being smashed and so on, and he read the Rigveda in Pondicherry in the original Sanskrit, partly self-taught, he found that this was a perfect symbol of the experiences he was going through. So people consider, and this was one blame I got after you know, my paper was circulated recently. Somebody said, you know, Sri Aurobindo was a man of his time, a product of his times. Well, maybe in some respects I do not know, but not in this respect. He was not following any given interpretation. He found Sayana disappointing, because Sayana, his main reproach to Sayana, the medieval commentator on the Rigveda, was that certain keywords for him had a constant range of meaning throughout the Rigveda. But Sayana did not respect that. And one keyword could be sometimes a river, sometimes heaven, sometimes sacrifice, sometimes something else. And there was no thread which allowed a certain consistency in the Rigveda. This was his main reproach, which actually he's not the only one to have made. Right. So now coming back to your question, and I'm sorry I'm taking a lot of time, but I think it is very central. We have to revisit the Veda, and I found that especially this question of the horse and the chariot, and we are told, you know, Aryans, everybody says Aryans introduced the horse and the chariot in India. Of course, I will not go into the controversy of horse bones having been found in the Harappan civilization and certified by very competent archaeologists, but let's keep that apart. But we are told that the text is emphatic about the chariot technology imported into India and horses, and this is how the Aryans came into India. And when you look at it closely, there is nothing of the kind. For example, they're supposed to have come with spoked wheel chariots. They're supposed to have introduced this technology. Again, there's a debate whether Harappans knew the spoked wheel or not. We can keep that aside. The point is that in the Veda, I found that not in a single passage where the spoked wheel, the chariot and the horse together. The chariot, Ratha, and it has many other names as you know. The horse, Ashwa, which is, they are all used in all kinds of allegories in exploded meanings, which you have to kind of thread together, and that's what I attempted to do in my paper, because there is a consistency, but the consistency doesn't work with the military interpretation. It works with the energy of the conquest of the Dasyus and Panis. It works with recovering powers from them, because the Panis, for example, remember the beautiful dialogue between Sarama and the emissary of Indra and the Panis, where she says, you are keeping all these cows and horses and treasures, and my master Indra is going to come and smash, and because you are not using them according to Ritam. Ritam is the cosmic order. So I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this is the gist of that dialogue. And therefore they do have powers, and they have, which are symbolized by horses and cows, and they have riches. And the objective of the Vedic quest, the Vedic quest, is to recover these. Now, if you transpose this to the Puranas, it's pretty much the same in a very different language, of course, but you have battles between the Devas and the Asuras. And the Asuras often also have treasures, and they will have, their cities, Tripura Sundari is the name of Shiva. Shiva destroying the cities of the Asuras. We have actually a transposition of the Vedic theme, but put in a story form. It's something which is very different, but the whole root symbolism remains the same. And nobody is going to say that, the Devas were a race of invaders who subjugated the Asura population of India. Nobody would say that, of course. So why do we say it in the context of the Rig Veda, where actually the imagery, the symbolism is just saying it's a complete parallel. So this is, in a nutshell, what I have tried to argue. There would be a lot more to say, but my conclusion is Rig Veda is a text which is still being tortured. We're not allowing it to reveal its fairly plain meaning. Karen Thompson, as you know, a very respected and highly competent Vedicist, has actually challenged the entire school, recent schools of Vedic scholars, saying you are misinterpreting the Rig Veda, you're not allowing the meaning to come forth. And though she has not fully elaborated her whole reading of the Rig Veda, and here and there I have some criticism to make, but by and large, I find that her foundation is much healthier, that she says we must allow this text to speak for itself and stop imposing on it, and she's very explicit on this military context, this chariot and this portrait, none of it is working. So it's time to go back to the text and look at it afresh. So I very much am in tune with this, and I think we have to, now in India, the difficulty will be to move away from the ritual schools, from Mimamsa, at least for some time. We have to do this exercise. And then we can go back, and maybe the Mimamsa schools can be also looked at differently. I do not know, because I have no expertise in that field. But I think that Rig Veda, we have to remember one thing, and I'll stop with this, that very soon after the Samhita period, it was acknowledged that Rig Veda was no longer understood. If we read Yaska, the Nighantu, Nirukta of Yaska, his attempt to recover the lost meaning of words from the Rig Veda, from the Samhitas. You know how Yaska begins? He quotes those Vedic scholars of his time, and Yaska was perhaps 800 BC, nobody really knows, but about that time, certainly pre-Paninian. And Yaska quotes those Vedic scholars who said, don't even try to find any meaning in the Vedas. There is no meaning. These are useless texts. So Yaska quotes them. It's so interesting that, first of all, the intellectual freedom, which that reflects, the kind of dissent you could voice, first of all, that's an aside, but nevertheless. And secondly, the fact that already in Yaska's time, people could say there's no meaning in the Rig Veda. Don't even try. So Yaska acknowledges that a lot of words have mutated, the meaning has shifted, and he tries to, as you know, rebuild some of the vocabulary, lost vocabulary of the Rig Veda. So therefore, there should be no dispute on the fact that there is a disappearance, like the Saraswati disappeared. Something of the Vedic quest and its motivation, its objective, also was perhaps lost. And we have to go back to it and at least do justice and retrieve these texts from these constant torturing. I have to stop here.
Okay.